In 1893, the city of Chicago unveiled a collection of buildings so large, so perfectly symmetrical, and so uniformly designed that visitors assumed they had been standing for centuries. They had been built in under 2 years. The official explanation is straightforward. The World's Columbian Exposition was a triumph of American industrial ambition. Thousands of workers, coordinated across dozens of contracting firms, delivered a temporary city on the shores of Lake Michigan. When the fair ended, most of it was demolished. The story is well documented, well celebrated, and taught in architecture schools to this day. But the buildings average 60 feet in height. The main hall, the manufactures and liberal arts building covered more than 30 acres under a single roof. It was, at the time, the largest enclosed space in human history. Built for an exhibition, torn down 18 months later. That detail sits quietly in the historical record. And once you notice it, you start noticing others. This documentary examines historical and architectural evidence through a documentary lens. All claims are grounded in documented records, and multiple interpretive frameworks are presented throughout. Across the 19th century, something unusual happened to educational architecture in the Western world. Schools got very, very large, not gradually, not in response to obvious population pressure, but quickly, and almost simultaneously across regions that had no coordinated communication. This is not a story about one building. It is a story about a pattern. In 1816, the year known in historical records as the year without a summer, a volcanic eruption in Indonesia sent enough particulate matter into the upper atmosphere to lower global temperatures by as much as 3 degrees Celsius. Crops failed across Europe and North America. Famine conditions spread from New England to Scandinavia. An estimated 90,000 people died in the immediate aftermath of the eruption alone, with secondary mortality extending for years. 1816 is also, quietly, one of the most concentrated years of institutional construction in the Western record. In New York State, the period between 1815 and 1825 saw the establishment of more than 40 formal educational institutions. In Massachusetts, the number of purpose-built school structures doubled within a decade. In the German states, Prussia launched what would become the modern compulsory education model, a bureaucratic infrastructure requiring buildings, administrators, attendance records, and physical plant on a scale the region had never attempted. The timing against the backdrop of the volcanic winter is not immediately legible. Famine years are not typically years of ambitious construction. Resources contract, labor becomes uncertain, and yet the buildings went up. Some of them went up very large. The Hamilton Oneida Academy in upstate New York, founded in 1793 and rebuilt in the early 19th century, occupied a structure with ceilings reaching 30 feet in its primary halls. The student population at its peak enrollment was fewer than 200. 30-foot ceilings served no acoustic function for a classroom of 40 students. They serve no pedagogical function. They require significantly more material, more labor, and more heating fuel than an identically sized room with a standard ceiling. In Philadelphia, the Germantown Academy, one of the oldest continuously operating schools in the United States, was built with proportions that its own historical literature describes as civic in scale. The phrase appears without elaboration. Civic in scale for a student body that in its founding decades numbered in the dozens. This pattern, oversized rooms, oversized windows, oversized entry halls, appears not just in prestigious institutions, but in rural district schools across the Northeast, in English grammar schools, in Scottish bird schools rebuilt after 1820, and in the newly constructed gymnasia of Central Europe. The question is not whether the buildings were large. The question is, large for what? Standard historical framing positions the scale as aspirational, a physical expression of Enlightenment ideals, the architectural argument for the importance of education. This explanation is reasonable, and it accounts for some of the evidence. Monument building as ideology is a well-understood historical phenomenon. But ideology rarely explains load-bearing specifications. When engineers study 19th century school buildings, they find floor systems rated for weights far in excess of what seated children would require. They find staircases wide enough to evacuate 1,000 people simultaneously in buildings that, according to enrollment records, never held more than 300. They find basement storage rooms with reinforced ceilings and ventilation systems that have no obvious relationship to the functions the buildings officially served. The engineer's question is simple. What were these floors built to hold? In 1832, the school was constructed in rural Ohio, in a county whose total population was under 4,000 people, with a main hall that measured 80 feet by 60 feet and a ceiling clearance of 22 feet. The building still stands. Local historians describe it as an example of frontier ambition. The phrase is affectionate. It does not explain the structure. Frontier ambition does not typically manifest as double-wide brick construction with iron-reinforced lintels. That is not ambition. That is engineering for permanence. Cross the Atlantic, and the pattern repeats. In Edinburgh, school buildings constructed between 1820 and 1850 were systematically larger than any enrollment projection of the period would require. In Lyon, the same. In Vienna, where the gymnasium system was being formalized under Habsburg administration, buildings went up with corridors wide enough to serve as secondary halls, corridors that in some cases were wider than the classrooms they connected. The administrators who commissioned these buildings were not naive. They were trained professionals operating within tight municipal budgets. They signed contracts. They approved specifications. They knew what they were building, which means they built it this way on purpose. The reason they had for building it this way, that is the part of the record that requires closer reading. The Erie Canal opened in 1825, connected the Hudson River to Lake Erie, 363 miles of engineered waterway through terrain that at the time had no significant population centers, no established trade routes, and no industrial base that would obviously justify the investment. The project cost $7 million in 1817 currency. For context, the entire federal budget that year was approximately $23 million. New York State spent nearly a third of the national government's annual expenditure on a canal through largely empty land. The official justification was westward expansion. The canal would open the interior to settlement and commerce. And it did eventually. But the timeline is strange. Construction began before the settlers. The infrastructure preceded the demand that was supposed to justify it. This is not unusual for the period. It is, in fact, the defining characteristic of the period. Between 1820 and 1870, the United States and the United Kingdom built infrastructure at a pace and scale that has never been fully reconciled with the population and economic data of the time. Rail networks expanded into territories where there were no passengers. Warehouses were constructed in port cities at volumes that exceeded, for decades, the actual tonnage moving through those ports. Telegraph lines went up along routes that carried, in their first years of operation, almost no traffic. The standard explanation is speculative investment entrepreneurs and governments building ahead of demand, betting on a future that they were, in effect, constructing through the act of building. It is a compelling framework. It explains a great deal. It does not explain the schools. Speculative infrastructure makes economic sense when the asset generates revenue once demand materializes. A canal generates tolls. A rail line generates fares. A warehouse generates storage fees. These are recoverable investments even when built early. A school building generates nothing. It is a cost center. There is no financial return on a 30-foot ceiling. There is no revenue mechanism that rewards over-engineered floors or corridors wide enough for industrial movement. And yet the same pattern that characterized the canals and the rail lines and the grain warehouses, infrastructure preceding and exceeding any identifiable demand, appears consistently in educational construction across both nations during the same decades. The buildings were not built speculatively in any commercial sense. They were built as though the population that would use them already existed, or was expected to arrive all at once. In Manchester, between 1830 and 1850, the number of purpose-built educational structures increased by over 300%. Manchester's population grew significantly in this period. The industrial migration is well documented, but the buildings were consistently sized for populations larger than even the optimistic projections of the time. School boards approved structures for 800 students in districts where enrollment had never exceeded 200. The gap was noted in municipal records. It was approved anyway. In Birmingham, the same. In Leeds, in the smaller mill towns of Lancashire, where budgets were tighter and resources more constrained, the proportional overbuild is, if anything, more striking. These were not wealthy institutions making aesthetic statements. These were working administrative bodies spending ratepayer money on buildings larger than any foreseeable use case required. Whether this reflects inherited design templates or something more systematic, the convergence across regions with no direct coordination is difficult to account for through coincidence alone. The administrative similarity is, in some ways, more striking than the architectural similarity. When historians examine the founding documents of school systems established across the United States and United Kingdom in the 1820s through 1850s, they find a remarkable consistency in bureaucratic structure. Attendance registers formatted identically, grade classification systems using the same categorical language, bell schedules following the same temporal divisions, building specifications referencing the same dimensional standards that, in many cases, have no traceable origin document. Where did the standard come from? In some cases, historians point to the influence of Prussian educational reformers, whose model was explicitly exported and adopted. Prussian connection is real and documented. But the Prussian model was primarily a pedagogical and administrative framework. It did not specify ceiling heights. It did not specify floor load ratings. It did not specify the width of corridors. The physical specifications traveled separately, and they traveled widely. In Ohio's Western Reserve, settled largely by New Englanders who brought their institutional habits with them, school buildings from the 1830s and 1840s share dimensional characteristics with school buildings in coastal Massachusetts, not approximately, but precisely. The same ceiling heights, the same window placement ratios, the same entry vestibule proportions. The settlers brought their furniture, their tools, their legal frameworks, and their building templates. The template, wherever it originated, produced buildings of a consistent and unusual scale. Kentucky, where settlement patterns were different, and New England influence was minimal, the same dimensional signatures appear in county school buildings dating from the same period. The transmission pathway there is less clear. The result is identical. Historians of technology use the term infrastructural inheritance to describe situations where a new system adopts the physical parameters of a prior system without necessarily understanding why those parameters were originally chosen. The width of standard railway gauge in Britain traces, through a chain of inheritance, to the wheel spacing of Roman military wagons. The connection is indirect, contested, and largely irrelevant to modern engineers, but the measurement persists. School buildings of the 19th century may represent a similar inheritance. Buildings built to a template whose origins predate the institutions that used it. Dimensions carried forward because they existed, not because anyone sat down and calculated that a room of 40 children requires 22 feet of vertical clearance. If that is true, the template came from somewhere, and the buildings it produced were not built for 40 children. The question of what they were built for is, on one level, an architectural question. On another level, it is a question about what the builders understood about the world they were building in, what they expected, what they inherited, and what they may have known that the official record does not straightforwardly contain. There is a name that appears at the edges of this inquiry. It surfaces in 19th century cartographic literature, in diplomatic correspondence from the early modern period, more recently in a body of online analysis that has attracted both serious scrutiny and considerable dismissal. The name is Tartaria. Page 3, start Caro 0149. The word appears on maps as early as the 13th century. Tartaria, sometimes spelled Tartaria, sometimes rendered as Grand Tartaria, was a geographic designation used by European cartographers to describe the vast interior of the Eurasian continent, stretching from the Caspian Sea east to the Pacific, and in some renditions extending north through Siberia, and on certain 16th and 17th century maps, across the North America. This was not a fringe cartographic choice. Tartaria appeared on maps produced by the most respected geographic institutions in Europe, Ortelius, Mercator, Blair. It appeared in diplomatic dispatches sent by Jesuit missionaries. It was referenced in trade documentation. For roughly 4 centuries, it was the standard European term for a real, if poorly understood, geographic and political space. By the mid-19th century, it had largely disappeared from official cartography. The regions it once described had been absorbed into the administrative frameworks of the Russian Empire, the Qing dynasty, and the expanding American territorial system. The name was retired. Its disappearance was gradual, unremarkable, and, in the standard historical account entirely logical. The modern reinterpretation of Tartaria did not begin in academic history. It began online in the mid-2010s, in communities that were examining anomalies in 19th century urban architecture, the same oversized buildings, the same over-engineered floors, the same dimensional consistency across regions, and reaching for a framework that could hold all of it together. The framework they found or constructed or inherited from earlier alternative history traditions centers on a proposition that Tartaria was not merely a cartographic label for a loosely defined region, but the name of a functioning civilization, one with a consistent architectural tradition, an administrative system, and a physical infrastructure that persisted in some form into the 19th century, before being either destroyed, absorbed, or deliberately obscured. This proposition is not accepted by mainstream historiography. It is important to say that clearly. The academic consensus holds that Tartaria was a geographic designation, not a political entity, and that the architectural patterns discussed in this documentary have explanations within the existing historical record. But the modern Tartaria conversation, whatever its methodological weaknesses, is pointing at something real, a genuine set of observations about 19th century built environments that the standard frameworks handle awkwardly. There are broadly three ways to interpret what those observations mean. The first interpretation is institutional inheritance. Under this reading, the oversized buildings, the consistent dimensions, the infrastructure before demand pattern, all reflect the transmission of design templates through professional networks, architects trained in common traditions, builders following shared pattern books, administrators adopting bureaucratic models from common sources. Prussian educational export is one vector. The influence of Enlightenment civic architecture is another. The buildings are large because largeness was the inherited ideal, and the ideal spread through documented professional channels. No lost civilization required. The second interpretation is demographic discontinuity. This reading takes seriously the possibility that the 19th century followed a period of significant population loss, not necessarily from a single catastrophic event, but from the compounding effects of the volcanic winters of the early 1800s, the pandemic mortality of the preceding centuries, and the agricultural collapses that punctuated the early modern period. Under this reading, the buildings were not built oversized. They were built for a population that had existed, or that administrators believed was about to return. The infrastructure preceded demand because the demand had recently collapsed, and the builders were restoring rather than projecting. The 1816 famine is not an interruption in this story. It is a data point in a longer sequence. The third interpretation is the one the Tartaria community has developed most extensively, and it requires the most careful handling. It proposes that the architectural and administrative consistency visible across the 19th century Western world reflects the physical legacy of a prior organizing system, a civilization, or network of civilizations whose built environment was inherited, repurposed, and relabeled by the institutions that came after it. The schools were not built to feel like civic monuments. They were civic monuments originally that were converted into schools. Floor ratings, the ceiling heights, the corridor widths, these were not aspirational. They were functional for whatever function the buildings originally served. None of these interpretations is without evidence. None is without difficulty. The institutional inheritance model struggles to explain the physical specifications, the load ratings, the ceiling heights, that have no obvious pedagogical origin. Pattern books circulated widely in the 19th century, but pattern books are prescriptive, not explanatory. They tell builders what to build. They do not explain why the standard was set where it was. The demographic discontinuity model is supported by a body of climate and epidemiological research that has grown significantly in the last 2 decades. The volcanic winters of the early 19th century were more severe than mid-20th century scholarship acknowledged. The mortality from the 1816-1820 famine period across Europe and North America was higher than most general history's record. World rebuilding after significant population loss would build differently than a world simply expanding. The evidence is compatible with this reading, though it does not require it. Tartaria hypothesis, as developed in its most rigorous online formulations, rests on architectural and cartographic evidence that is genuinely anomalous. The maps are real. The buildings are real. The dimensional consistencies are measurable. Where the hypothesis becomes difficult is in the proposed mechanism The claim that a unified civilization was erased from the record thoroughly enough that only its physical infrastructure remains. That is a large claim. It requires a scale of deliberate action for which the evidence is, at present, circumstantial. Turn for a moment to 1816, the year without a summer, crops failing from Maine to the Rhine, famine in the Highlands of Scotland, empty fields in New England, and somewhere in the administrative machinery of the Western world, decisions being made about what to build next, what kind of structures to raise, to what specifications, on what scale. Buildings that went up in the years immediately following 1816 are still standing in many cases. They are schools now, or have been schools. Some have been converted to municipal offices, to libraries, to apartment buildings. Their original designations, in the records that survive, are educational. But the records that survive are the records that were kept. And the records that were kept by the institutions that came after. This is not an argument for any single explanation. It is an observation about the shape of the question. When a building is too large for its stated purpose, and when that pattern repeats across continents, across decades, across cultures that were not in obvious communication, the most honest response is not to flatten the anomaly into the nearest available explanation. The most honest response is to keep looking at the building. The dimensions are fixed. The bricks are real. The floor can hold more weight than the children who walked across it would ever require. What the builders knew, and what they expected those floors to hold, is a question the buildings themselves cannot answer, but they have not stopped asking it.